Hey friends, Catherine here from Research Rockstar, and today we have a special guest. I've invited a new friend, Sarah Rose Marcus, to join us today to talk about a topic I think is really interesting. One of the things that comes up a lot for those of us who are in qualitative research is what's the best way to really analyze qualitative data? We all know that by definition, qualitative data is a lot messier to work with than quantitative data. But in talking to team managers that we work with here and have students from here at Research Rockstar, one of the things that I often hear from the team managers is that they are interested in making sure that qualitative data is being analyzed with a certain amount of rigor. And of course, we all know that there's a huge continuum in terms of the ways and the rigor with which we analyze qualitative data. And there are a lot of options. And one of the things that I really enjoyed getting to know about Sarah Rose is that she's a qualitative researcher with a PhD. She's got that sort of academic rigor, which I think can really add a lot of value. And she and I specifically started talking about the topic of grounded theory recently, which is something that a lot of qualitative researchers actually don't really know about, but it's a really important concept that really can be used more often in the world of commercial qualitative research. So Sarah Rose, thank you so much for joining me today and for offering to give us an overview of what exactly grounded theory is about.
Sure. So, hi everyone. Welcome to my presentation. I'm going to talk about grounded theory for qualitative research, as we just talked about. And before I begin, just wanted to introduce myself really briefly, and then I'll explain what we'll be talking about today. So I'm a qualitative researcher, instructor, and social scientist, and I use a variety of different methods to understand how people date and establish their communities online. So I've used interviews, ethnography, focus groups, content analysis, and a variety of different ways to understand these questions. And I'm a big fan of grounded theory. I used it in my dissertation to help analyze a particular process. And I'm excited to talk about this with you. So, today we're going to talk about what grounded theory is, when and why to use grounded theory, and how to use it. So, we're going to go through the analysis process. So, what is grounded theory? It's really a form of analysis that studies people's experience with some kind of process and creates an explanation for how that process works. And you're basically generating theory from data that you've collected in your own study and not from previous theory. So the categories that you use to code your qualitative data are going to be created by you, and they're going to emerge from the data itself, and they won't be specified beforehand. So why you might use grounded theory. Let's say your client is an acne cream brand and they want to know the different pain points that their demographic of clients go through when trying to treat their acne and what that entire process looks like from start to finish. You might use grounded theory because there might not be previous research on this particular process. And if you do look at previous research, it might not exactly target the right demographic and you might be leading yourself in the wrong direction. So, grounded theory is going to help you think about the process in a more holistic way and uncover new data that you might not have before the study. It also helps you overcome biases and explore alternative explanations for what's going on. So, it keeps an open mind, as I mentioned before, and you analyze the data from the ground up, as the name grounded theory suggests. So, again, when there are no existing theories or there's a limited amount of theories to explain your process of interest, that's when you're going to be using grounded theory. As another example for my dissertation, there was no theory to explain how young Jewish adults in New York City overcome challenges in their online dating and social media engagement. And so I use grounded theory to identify a 6-stage process in which this particular demographic overcomes those issues. So when you use grounded theory, you'll of course begin by identifying a topic like the acne cream example that I talked about earlier. So identifying the topic and of course thinking through the goals and constraints related to the research study. And then you'll choose a qualitative method because grounded theory comes from qualitative research. So if you're observing how people do something, you might want to use ethnography. If you're observing why or understanding why people do things and attitudes, then you might choose interviews. So thinking through the particular qualitative method. And then in the next stage, you're going to begin recruiting for your study. So you're going to use theoretical sampling when you sample people who are undergoing the process you're describing. So thinking about the acne cream example, you'll think about the different cases that are important. So you might want to look at teens with acne, you might want to look at adults with acne, and you might even want to talk to parents of teens with acne as well. And one of the big differences is that with grounded theory, the data analysis and collection happen together. So you're not just distributing a survey and then analyzing the results. You're doing an interview, doing some memoing, thinking through the findings, and then that might even inform the questions you ask in the future. So you also might develop theory that suggests further cases to sample from that you didn't initially expect. You might realize as you're doing your interviews that you actually might need to talk to a few people who overcame acne but have occasional breakouts because they might be going through the same type of process. So you'll be comparing people, places, settings, conditions, and events related to the particular process of interest. And of course, again, you'll be thinking about the constraints and timelines and all of that as well. So you'll be collecting the data, whether it's ethnography, focus groups, interviews, and you're going to ask open-ended questions about the core process that you're examining. So you want to think about what is the process. You want to have questions related to what influenced the process to occur. So you might ask, describe the last time you went out and bought acne cream. What was the process like? Something super broad so that you can get really rich data. And then you might want to find out what the outcome of that in particular experience was. So in the next stage or throughout, you'll be analyzing. And there are three main stages that take place when you are analyzing the data. So you'll begin with open coding. So this is when you just want to scan your transcripts and determine just general categories that are coming up over and over. So it might be friends, family, acne breakout, shame, just all the key characteristics that are going on. And keep a really open mind and make memos throughout. And you may have two categories that you end up collapsing together because they are describing the same process. You might also end up getting rid of some of the categories in the future when you conduct more interviews, for example, and you find that it's not really coming up as much as you thought. But just begin with that open-ended process so that you can begin to identify the themes. In the second stage, you'll do axial coding. So this is when you want to start thinking about how the categories might connect with each other. What kind of theory or story are we trying to tell? What's the overarching process? So you might just begin to kind of roughly sketch out what you think is going on. And then in the last stage, you'll do selective coding. So this is when you're going to write a more specific story about how the theory explains the core process. So you might say friends and family members play a vital role in helping consumers manage their acne breakouts by doing X, Y, and Z. You might have an overarching process that you're going to be describing. So that's going to be the last stage of the coding process. Here's another example. So if you look at the left, these are the open codes. So that's that first stage. So you have conflict, equality, compromise, listening, sharing ideas, role clarification, and diversity. In the next stage, axial coding, you might want to think about what the overarching process these are describing. So if you think about conflict, equality, and compromise, they'll go with collaboration, listening and sharing ideas, it's communicating, and then role clarification and diversity go with understanding team. In the last stage, you're going to want to think about the overarching story that collaboration, communication, and understanding team is trying to tell. So it might go into teamwork. That's the overarching process you're describing. And you got that from those initial codes, refining them into broader categories that connect with each other, and then you connect them together to tell a story. And you even might recruit more participants with similar characteristics after doing this and ask them similar questions to verify your theory. But again, it all depends on how much time you have with your particular data collection and what your constraints are as well, which I'll be talking about in this slide. So there's several limitations to grounded theory that are important to point out. So it's very difficult and time consuming to recruit all these different cases of participants, thinking through the different parents and kids and what kinds of cases, and recruiting participants later that you thought you didn't know you needed up front. It's also time consuming to analyze data without having any pre-existing category before, because you're creating the categories. So again, it is more time consuming. Another limitation is that you might be a little biased in terms of creating the entire theory or process. So one suggestion that I have is to ask for a second opinion. Go through your interview transcript with somebody else and talk about the main codes that you identified and compare them with each other to see if there's intercoder reliability. And then the last limitation is more just a general limitation of qualitative data, but it's a small sample, so you're not going to be representing all of the acne consumers and using numbers to back it up. But you are going to have rich data that is going to be describing a process that's going to be very valuable, especially if it hasn't been identified before. So that's a little bit about grounded theory, but I'm going to leave my contact information up. I'm happy to answer questions further about particular cases that you might have, and I'm here to answer questions from Catherine as well.
Excellent. Sarah Rose, thank you so much for that overview. I know this is going to be a topic that's going to be new to a bunch of our students, so thank you so much for helping us out with this. So I do have some questions. Actually, would you mind going back to slide 10 for a second? So one of the things that I thought was interesting was that when you are coming up with codes, and I think this is true for any kind of coding when we have in qualitative research, sometimes people can struggle with how narrow should it be. Like you want it to be specific enough so that it's meaningful, but not so specific that you're really getting caught in the weeds. Like in this example, like friends, like theoretically, I could imagine that the topic of friends could come up a few different ways related to acne cream. As our hypothetical example, it might be, I might want to know what my friends purchase, or I want to know I want to hear from my friends about how they feel about acne. Like it could be, like I can imagine a few different ways that friends could relate to a topic related to acne. Do you have any guidance or experience to share about how specific you want these codes to be?
Yeah, well, sometimes you might, you may even begin with being more specific, like friends suggestions versus friends feedback or something like that. And again, you may collapse it into just like friendship support or something like that, so that it's sort of an overarching category. Or you might have friends be the category, and then you have little subcategories, and then your basically overarching thesis is that friends and family help, and then you have like a sub, this is how friends help and this is how family helps. So it's just all a way to sort of organize it into an overarching process.
Do you feel that there's a general guideline on, when you're first doing your first pass and you're coming up with your codes, like you wouldn't want to have more than X codes? Like if you find that you've got, a really large amount of codes, like you just did 10 in-depth interviews, you don't want 40 codes, for example.
Right. I don't have a quantitative number. I think maybe because I'm qualitative, I try not to follow like magic numbers, but I don't know if there's an exact number, but I would say that, I mean, if you have these 10 interviews, the interviews might be a few pages long, but I doubt that they're going to have like hundreds of codes per interview. It's probably going to be overarching subtopics about their experience, and they're not going to be, and you have a targeted interview guide, and therefore I feel like it's just going to lend itself to fewer codes. But I don't know if I have a magic number.
Okay. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that you emphasized early on is that when we take this kind of approach, we don't necessarily do all of our recruiting up front. So if we are doing in-depth interviews, or we are doing ethnography, or even if we're doing focus groups, maybe we're ultimately planning to do 4 or 5 focus groups, but maybe we're initially only going to recruit for 1 or 2. And this really resonates with me a lot, because I think that all of us as experienced qualitative researchers know we've all been in that case where we're kicking off like a series of 6 or 8 focus groups, and you learn so much in that first focus group. And very often what that might mean is modifying the discussion guide, but it really can also often have implications for modifying screening. I thought it was really interesting that, there's this idea of we might start the research and learn something from, discover something that is going to cause us to want to change our actual screening criteria. In the work you did, for example, in New York, did you do that? Did you actually change your screening criteria as you went through your ethnographic research?
Yes, I initially began thinking about different gender and sexuality because I was looking at dating. And then I realized that the level of religiousness was really important. So thinking about, participants who were more modern versus more religious. And then I also ended up scoping my project. I decided I wasn't going to focus on the extremely religious communities, um, because it would take too much time to gain access, and I had my time constraints. So I thought through what are the main, and also the main topic that I was looking at was how young adults deal with this tension between wanting to be modern adults and wanting to maintain a sense of religion. So that also influenced the scope, because I realized those ultra religious Jewish people were going to be less focused on that tension anyway. But yeah, throughout the process, especially after I did the observation, that's when I realized that that I should look at these different religious categories as well.
Awesome. I love that. And I can definitely see that in a lot of commercial research too. I mean, I can, if I'm doing research with brand X customers about understanding how they use brand X kitchen appliance, a kitchen appliance or something, I could totally see doing some research, discovering something about the different ways people use those products, and deciding, hey, I've got something really here that I should probably rescreen. I should modify my screening for the next wave. And I'll be able to learn even more. In your experience, when you went through the process of doing the coding and then the axial coding, and you do eventually get to your story, do you find that there's sometimes, or in your experience, was there actually multiple stories, or did you find that it actually pretty much came around to one common story that really did represent what you were seeing in the market?
Um, I think that represented there was an entire model of how these young adults overcame these challenges. But when I would go over the data with my advisor, sometimes we would say, you know what, I think this step goes after this step. So we would start to think through, we would take index cards and lay out all the steps, and then we would think through the process, and we might adjust either the placement of the model, or we might add, make something a branch or a subheader, for example, social support. And then underneath it's like validation versus looking for information. These are the types of support that they're receiving. So it was sort of just like a game of organizing having the overarching story and making sure all the data is organized in a way that illustrates the process completely.
Fantastic. And I like that you mentioned index cards. I know a lot of us qualitative researchers, we use index cards when we're writing our reports. I know I've done that myself many times, differently than how you were using them, but definitely trying to keep myself honest and capturing things and writing them down. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, there are a lot of different ways of doing qualitative analysis. Are there alternates that you had considered before using grounded theory for this particular project that you were working on? Or had you had experiences doing it in a different way before you did this?
I had a lot of experience with grounded theory. I definitely, once I was starting to do the research and analyze and think through how I'd analyze the findings, I did some desk research and tried to look at young Jewish adults and and thinking through like online dating research and community research. But it was hard to find a pre-existing model where I could be like, all right, I'm going to base my findings off of this. And so I just leaned towards the grounded theory because there wasn't anything that really described what was going on that I could at least adjust or add to. I needed to start from scratch.
Got it. Then I think just to wrap up, I'd like to just share what I think many of our students would find, which is that, as qualitative researchers, we don't always code our transcripts. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. When we do have projects where we're coding, typically, like if I'm doing 30 in-depth interviews, I will have them, I'll screen and recruit for the interviews. I'll have one discussion guide. And yes, I might modify the discussion guide after the first few. I usually don't rescreen people. I usually don't change the screening. So I think that's one of the big differences here. I also think that even though in qualitative research, we always say we're going into it for discovery, to explore customer attitudes and behaviors, I really like your point that the definition of grounded theory is not starting with any sort of a priori model, that you're going into it really with a pure frame of mind of, I'm going to start this research, I'm going to truly just explore, in this case, a process, and I'm not going to go in with any preconceived notions about what kind of specific codes I'm likely to have, which I really like for avoiding the potential risk of bias. So I think that those are probably two of the biggest differences is, going in, trying not to go in with your preconceived ideas about what your codes are likely to be, going in with the willingness that you are not going to do all of your recruiting up front. Again, if you've got 30 IDIs, maybe you only pre-recruit for 5 of them, and then give yourself some time in your schedule so that you can modify and continue recruiting. And then I actually think some of the end parts are very parallel to what most of us do in qualitative research in terms of now, whether we've done a formal coding process or not, we do have to document what the themes are, what we see as the key takeaways. And we also have to make sure that we're helping our client, our reader, understand how this represents the broader target market, right? Because we want to be able to come out at the end of the project and say, we've discovered that there's a common process that represents what this target market goes through, right? And in reality, maybe we do come up with a couple of processes. I can imagine certainly from my own work in market research that very often we'll examine things like customer journey for purchasing a certain type of product. And there's one main journey, but we may have a customer segment that actually has a totally different journey. But clearly trying to get the same output here as, you get to the end and you want to have a story to tell that's really going to capture and represent that target market, I think is really where we all want to get to. But I think this is a great way of doing it with a little bit more rigor and hopefully controlling for a bit more bias. I also have to imagine that if I had a client who was a really demanding client, that this kind of approach might really appeal to them because it's almost more defensible than, if you just do your 30 IDIs and you say, oh, I wrote a report. Now you can say, yeah, I did my 30 IDIs. It was an iterative process. We learned this, so we iterated on that, and we learned this and we iterated on that. And I feel like it's almost showing a higher level of rigor than we sometimes get to with qualitative research.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense in terms of, they obviously want to know what you found and what they can do, but just kind of showing a little bit about the process, they might get a sense of how you got there as well.
Yeah. We want people to feel good about it. In market research, we always have always have clients who are different, right? Sometimes I've had clients who really love qualitative research and actually aren't really big fans of survey research. And I've had other clients who are just the opposite. But I do feel these days that there's a lot of really great qualitative research going on and that people are looking at it really closely. So I love the idea of having another tool in the tool chest for those situations where the clients are really demanding and are going to expect a really high level of rigor in terms of how the research was done and analyzed. Sarah Rose, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. And if you want to just go back to the end slide, we'll just show your contact information one last time. Everybody, I think it's wonderful that Sarah Rose has shared her contact information with you here, and she's on LinkedIn, obviously, as we can see here. So that's a great way to connect with her as well. Sarah Rose, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat again soon.